Okay.
And I'm going to introduce you first. I checked your personal homepage for this. Güneş is a senior researcher at the University of Oxford. Are you still with Phil Tor's lab, or are you more?
Yes, I am. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, as we sent in the abstract, his work is at the intersection of generative modeling, probabilistic programming, and deep learning. Oh, I was disconnected for a second, I guess. I'm just going to repeat what I said. His work is at the intersection of generative modeling, probabilistic programming, and deep learning, usually with applications of machine learning for scientific discovery. I didn't know that, but he's also involved with NASA and ESA. Is this European Space Agency?
Yeah.
Oh, that's really cool, Dinesh. He has done a lot of interesting work. He received his PhD from, okay, I worked for this pronunciation, Universitat Autónoma de Barcelona. Is it correct?
Barcelona.
Barcelona, damn it. It's Google's fault. And he is a very good friend of mine, and I'm looking forward to his talk. Enjoy.
All right. Thank you, Fatma. Okay, I'm going to share screen. Oh no, I cannot. Can you please enable screen sharing?
You are a co-host, no? No.
Okay, now it's fine. Yeah, now it's working. Okay. All right. Do you see this?
Yes.
Okay. So I have some connection issues sometimes. Like if something like I mean, if you stop hearing me, please let me know so I don't talk to the wall for 1 hour and then realize I was talking to the wall. It happened once. Okay, so let's present this. And maybe I can turn off my video just to ensure things are fine. Okay. All right, so this is like, so today I'm going to talk about probabilistic programming. I don't know if people are familiar with this, but it's a way of basically specifying generative models like fully using a programming language. So you might be familiar with generative models in deep learning where you learn models from data. This is something different. This is the case where you have a way of sitting down and basically specifying the generative model itself. And because of this, it's like a very good technique for fields where you have simulators available. For example, people have simulators in autonomous driving. They simulate cities like pedestrians, or like people have simulators for creating training data for like labeled training data for like settings where you don't have a lot of those. Like anything for which you can define a synthetic data distribution, you can think that this is applicable for that. But the thing I'm going to present here is a particle physics application, but the techniques are machine learning and probabilistic inference techniques that are basically like general techniques. So it's not just about physics. Yeah, so this is, I think Fatma did a better job in talking about these things. So this slide is a bit messy, but so I'm in Oxford, and I do a bit of like work with Microsoft Research. I do two main things. One is probabilistic programming, and the other thing I'm interested in is automatic differentiation or differentiable programming. And basically, I am very interested in like applying these things to solve some scientific problems. Like that's really exciting for me. So I collaborate with people. Basically, I find some people, I collaborate with them. I ask them, what are your problems? What can we do? Like, does it require machine learning stuff? If they say yes, we start collaborations. It's basically taking the same techniques, applying them to a lot of domains. And most of these domains, they are domains where people have simulators. So it's not a coincidence. For in space sciences, in particle physics, they have models that they can write down because they are scientists. They model things. This is what they do. Basically, that's the story here. And the NASA and the European Space Agency involvement is there is a summer program. It's called the Frontier Development Lab. I don't know if you heard about it. So I'm involved in this since many years. It's like a summer school type of thing for 2 months. There's an application process, so people apply to this. We get two PhD students from machine learning, two two PhD students from like space sciences. It can be heliophysics, astrobiology, whatever. And we supervise them. So we have supervisors from machine learning, like myself, and like supervisors from domain sciences. We put them together in a room, and they keep working on a problem, like very well specified problem with a lot of resources. It's supported by Google, IBM, NVIDIA, like a lot of compute capacity. Problem is specified. They just have complete, like everything ready for them to solve a problem. So it's like a very cool thing. And if you have interest in this type of areas, you can always contact me and I can talk to you about that. So, and when there is no pandemic, this thing is actually running in NASA. So you really get to go to one of the NASA campuses. It's in NASA Ames. It's basically next to Google campus in Mountain View. There is a NASA place. You just stay in NASA and you do machine learning work in NASA for a couple of months. So it's that type of very cool thing. Yeah, so basically I'm doing this stuff. I have a workshop. It's called this machine learning and physical sciences. So if you have interest in this type of things, it's at NeurIPS. And if you are planning to attend NeurIPS this year, so the workshop is happening at 11 December. So you are very welcome to join that. And like we can also chat in the workshop. All right, okay. I should maybe put this here. Yeah, so this talk is about the simulation and like inference in simulation, basically. And like so this is interesting for because like computational models and simulation are very useful in a lot of scientific fields, and they are basically at all scales. Like you can have the smallest scale of particle physics all the way through like material design, drug discovery, and climate science and cosmology. Where in cosmology, people have models of the universe. Basically, they are modeling the formation of galaxies and filaments, like unifying these things and like everything. In particle physics, you are modeling just some elementary particles. So, and all these things are about basically simulation in practice. And so this work is about bringing simulation and probabilistic programming together. So I'm going to explain both of these aspects and like establish the connection. So if you think about simulators, so you can show it like this. It's like a black box. It's basically a piece of the software that has some parameters or inputs and some outputs. So it's simulating something. It means basically the obvious thing to do with this, and in many cases, this is the only use of the simulator, is called prediction. So you basically model some system or phenomenon, like you have a simulator. When you run your simulator, you get generated, you get samples of data generated at the output of the simulator. And this is useful for settings where you are predicting the future or making projections or guesses like that are going forward in time, that are following this arrow of time going right here. So for example, some examples are like this. You can have some economical models. This is a flood model, like you are predicting how a city will be flooded based on the local geography, or I don't know, you can have climate models. So you are predicting the future. So this is the obvious forward prediction use. But in many cases in science, you need the inverse. So the interesting thing is always about the inverse. And this means that somebody gives you some data that actually corresponds to the output of the simulator, and you are trying to infer the parameters that explain or that can produce the observed case. And this is called an inverse problem. And it's a manual process, and it's a very difficult thing to do in general. So some examples of this is, so in gene networks, they have people have forward models or simulators that can simulate gene expression data. And this is measured by some microarrays or like basically sensors. You get gene expression data, and you are trying to infer or discover the underlying gene network just given some data that corresponds to the output of a simulator. Easier to like relate example is seismology. For example, people have a very good understanding of how seismic waves work. basically you can simulate seismic waves through media like Earth's crust. So you can simulate an earthquake. You can model with a lot of accuracy how waves are going to propagate and reach different parts of the map. And the task is to get some seismometry readings, like such as these like one-dimensional data, and you are trying to infer the sources of like the earthquakes locations or like local geological characteristics. So it's another immense problem. And in particle physics, so people have these like giant experiments that I'm sure you know about at CERN. There is the Large Hadron Collider, for example. It's a huge giant experiment where they like collide protons and they record the result of the collision. And they have a forward model again, like they can have very complicated simulators simulating the interactions of particles and how two particles are going to collide and what are the different probabilities of things that can come out of the collision. But all this model is forward in time. And the actual task is the inverse of this. So somebody gives you the detector reading, and you are trying to discover what are the initial conditions or what is actually going on inside the detector, at the center of it that you don't see. You are trying to, it's like a camera where you record everything that happens by using the sensors around the mechanism, but you have no way of seeing what is going on inside. You are supposed to infer that based on the outcome in the instrument. So it's another inverse problem. So probabilistic programming is some like subfield of machine learning that allows you to define probability models and give you some automated way of doing Bayesian inference of parameters conditioned on observed output. So this thing is a way of handling inverse problems, and it's actually like the perfect thing for some inverse problem setting like this. So maybe you heard about Pyro or Edward or Stan. Pyro is kind of famous. It's developed by Uber people. And there is the new thing is called TensorFlow probability. Maybe you heard about that one. So these things are good, but they have been limited to toy and small scale problems. And this is a problem because let's say you want to do probabilistic programming to do inference and like do an inversion. And you are supposed to learn this system from scratch. Let's say Pyro. You are supposed to use Python, learn Pyro library, implement all your things in Pyro from scratch so that you can get some data and do inference and get some like a distribution over some parameters that explain your data. So this limitation has been the main cause of like having small scale applications of probabilistic programming. So in this work, we make a bridge between existing large scale, very significant big simulators and this probabilistic programming libraries basically. And the main idea is that simulators, if they are stochastic, and most of the simulators are, they define probability models by sampling random numbers. So this means that if somebody wrote a simulator that is stochastic in nature, what I mean is every time you run the simulator with the same parameters, if you get a variation in the output, like you have some stochasticity. In practice, it means the code base in the simulator, it's doing some random number sampling. And this is actually a probabilistic model, even if the person writing the simulator didn't plan that. They basically implemented the probability model. And there's a way of recovering that and treating existing stochastic simulators as probabilistic programs. So this is what we did in this work, and it's the first time this is happening in the probabilistic programming community, basically. And so you need some sort of infrastructure to catch these random number calls and record them and treat them as sampling from a prior distribution in a Bayesian inference setting. By the way, if there are questions, like I will be really happy to get interrupted and answer questions. So it would also tell me that you are still there. I like that. Let me know. All right, so I'm going now. So This is a library. It's called PyPro. It's a system we develop. It's like a prototype system that allows you to do basically this type of thing, like catching random number calls in simulators. And the way it works is this. So the simulators, like when you have access to the simulator source code, you can find the places in the source code that does random number sampling. Imagine a Python code base. You will have a place where you call numpy.random something, or random.random, or pytorch.random, or whatever. So there will be some places where you do random number sampling. So basically, we have an automated way of taking all these random number samples and directing that to this system called PyPro, so that like the code behaves the same way. The code does the random number sampling, but every time it does that, we do some extra side effects. Like we can record all the history of random number samples that happened in the execution, and this is called an execution trace. Basically, every time you run the simulator, we have a way of recording one by one all the random number samples that happened in the given execution. And this is the basis of doing Bayesian inference. So you need to record an execution trace. And so there is like a bit of software infrastructure that does that. It's called the PPX. So it supports these programming languages. So if you have some stochastic code in any of these basically languages, you can connect that the random number generation process to the PyProp library, and you are basically good to go. So the cool thing is, if you have a giant simulator implemented in C++, like they do in particle physics, they don't have to rewrite it. They just there is minimal change in the code. The code remains the same. You just need to direct the random calls to this protocol, and everything is ready to use. Basically, that's the thing here. And for people who are interested in how these things work in practice, like there are a lot of details. It's very difficult to cover it in a single talk, but there is a way of uniquely labeling each random number choice by this thing called addresses. And the way it works is you have a stack trace. You might be familiar with that if you have some like debugging in a code base, that you get an error, let's say uncode error, and you get a stack trace. So what we do is we use that type of capability. We make a label of that random number choice at runtime to uniquely identify that. The way this works is you are supposed to label each possible random number choice in the code base, because we are going to treat these things as latent random variables, and we need to be able to distinguish them from each other. We need to be able to say, okay, this is the random number call, and this is where it happens. So you need to identify them. And we use this type of automatically generated strings to label them. And these things are interpretable. For example, this is from a particle physics simulator. For somebody who knows the simulator, it's called Sherpa. You can read this and have an idea about what's going on and why did you need a random sample. For example, this is generating an event. This is a function. Then there is like a hadron decay event. Hadrons are some types of like particles in a standard model. At some point, somebody needed a uniform random number, and this is what happened. So as a series of all these function calls, there was a need for a uniform random number. So you put all of that together, you make a label, and you just label it and save it somewhere, and you keep executing. So once you have this, you can do conditioning by comparing simulated output with observed data. I'm going to explain how this works a bit better later. So when you have these two conditions satisfied, the recording of the random number samples and the conditioning thing, you have basically a full probabilistic programming system. It means you can take any simulator and you can treat it as a probabilistic model, generative model. It's already implemented and ready to use. And when you have that, you basically do Bayesian inference. It means you can approximate the distribution of parameters that explain your given data in terms of posterior distribution. And you can get that through different inference engines like a Markov chain Monte Carlo. These things will be already implemented in the system, and it will be just the automated way of getting some distributions. And so there are some difficulties here, because when you take a giant simulator and treat it as a probability model, it's so big that you need a lot of innovations to make things actually work, because it's very computationally intensive to get some posteriors with MCMC and other techniques. So we needed to do a lot of new basically techniques to handle this type of thing. And the short story is that we use some sort of deep learning supported inference engine to make things work at the large scale. We do some amortized inference. So I'm going to explain how that works. So are you still there, by the way? Can somebody tell me something?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. I assume no questions. I realize it's not extremely clear for people who haven't seen probabilistic programming before, but like things start to make sense after you have seen 2 or 3 talks like this, and like maybe look at some introductory papers. So okay, let's continue. So
can I ask a question?
Yes. Yeah.
So do we assume that the simulator is 100% correct, or do we get an uncertainty from the simulator also?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So it relates to like statistical modeling, and like there is this famous thing like no model is correct. Like what was that? Maybe somebody remembers. So to the degree that you trust your model, you can do some like explanations of data, and all the models are correct, incorrect. Like in practice, you can never model something perfectly, but it's good enough for some cases. For example, if particle physics is an extreme case. In particle physics, the standard model of particle physics is like the best model in the history of science. Basically, these people trust it so much, like they have predictions like to 10 to the minus 10 something something. They expect some numbers to happen just because of this model, and they find these things in experiments. So if you have that type of model, you can say that, yeah, my model is correct. But if you have an autonomous driving simulator, somebody just sit in a game engine and make some like trees and buildings and stuff. So that model is not correct, but it's still useful because it can give you synthetic data that kind of looks like real world. It's still useful. So I'm just trying to communicate, like there are different ways of, there are different degrees of accuracy you can expect from the simulator. You just need to be aware of it and don't trust it so much. Like you can trust your result as much as you can trust your model. And the other thing is the uncertainty is the key aspect of all these things. So I will show you some examples. At the end of all these things, you get a distribution over results. So this never gives you some like single answer, like a point estimate or like single prediction. Everything you get out of this type of system is like based on sampling. You run a lot of simulations and you estimate things in histograms. Basically, you get posterior distributions, and they basically show uncertainty in all the results. So it's a bit like Bayesian deep learning, but Bayesian deep learning doesn't really work. I don't know if people agree with this. Bayesian deep learning gives you some uncertainty estimates and distributions and things, but there is no way of knowing if these things are actually meaningful or they are real posterior distributions. In this setting, you really get a posterior distribution based on your prior and the likelihood. So everything is fully specified for people who know or care about like this statistical ways of doing things.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe the answer was a bit too long, and I don't know. Maybe I didn't cover everything, but we can talk about it later. Yeah. So this amortized inference thing is basically doing all these things in a manageable and scalable way, and it works like this. It has 2 phases. So in the first part, we do some training. This is going to train some deep learning system to help your inference problem later. And it works like that. So you can run many copies of your simulator box. So it means you just run your simulator many times, and you record these execution traces I was talking about. So you create a data set of execution traces. And I show them here in this color, like, so these gray things are latent variables. And the orange one is the observable thing, which is usually at the end. So you have a lot of random choices, random. And in the end, you have some data, simulated data. So you record all these instances, and you do this deep learning part where you train a deep learning model, like a recurrent neural network, where you invert the process. So you take the output of the simulator, this orange thing, you make this the input of your neural network, and you expect the neural network to predict distributions over all the latent variables given the data in that simulation. So when you do it like this neural network learns some distributions over all the latents in the system, conditioned on some data input. So this is actually what enables this amortized inference idea. So you do that. This is very costly. If your simulator is very big and very like expensive to run, this is like a this can be very costly, and it can take days and weeks and whatever. Actually, we did this in a supercomputer at some point for this application, but you don't always have to. Once you do this, you get a trained neural network, and all these things can be forgotten and discarded and whatever. So you just have your trained neural network, which is actually a nice little manageable deep learning artifact, and then you are good to go. So then you go to the inference part, and the reason this type of things are called amortized inference is this idea. So you do some costly thing only once, and you use this later to like do something so much better than the initial cost of like training. This is amortized. This is where the word is coming from. And so yeah.
Something is,
yeah.
Are all these neural networks the same?
Yes. Yeah.
And the form of the observation, can it be like visual data, control parameters in case of autonomous driving? What is the form of, are there any constraints on the form of?
No, I mean, it can be anything. For example, in this physics application, this was like a 3D, like a volumetric data, like voxels. You can think this as images. Like you can have an autonomous driving simulator, let's say. It samples the objects in the scene. Where are these objects placed in 3D? Like where is the camera? Like all the stuff describing the scene, all the latent explanation of a scene. And it simulates a frame, a synthetic image. Then in effect, this thing would do like learn how to get an image, just gets the image, and it tries to infer all the latents that can create that image in the simulator, for example.
And the uncertainty is modeled in these latent variables, basically.
Yeah, uncertainty comes as a side effect of like doing all these things many times, and like making a histogram, basically, like in the simplest terms. But it's a bit more complicated than it. There are inference engines. They do the same thing differently. So I'm going to, I think, explain one of them. But yeah, so that is actually the most boring and like difficult to explain part. So this inference, like how do you get the actual posterior distributions? It's very difficult to cover in like a presentation. It takes a lot of time to explain. But the idea is like you run everything a lot of times. So for example, I'm going to explain it actually now in the bottom. So let's say we train this network and we forget about this, like we have a trained network, okay? So then we come to the inference part. You have your trained network, and somebody gives you a completely new observed data. So you take that, you run this like many copies of this trained network with this single unique observed data, and all of them like give you some different values. Because like the neural network is structured such that the outputs are parameterizing distributions. So it's like learning proposal distributions at the output. Does that make sense? But so so it's not a deterministic thing. I mean, it's deterministic, but it's parameterizing distributions at the output. So you can imagine that like it's an LSTM, let's say. There is a CNN embedding of this image. If it's an image, goes to the LSTM. And LSTM at each time step, it gives you parameters of a Gaussian, let's say, like, or any other distribution. And this distribution is treated as a proposal distribution. So you sample from that distribution. So you run this many, many times. You get these samples and you run the simulator with these things. And you basically populate histograms from these things with some extra details that I'm not explaining. Does that make a bit of sense? I hope it does.
Makes sense, Güneş. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, okay.
Can I ask also a question?
Yeah, yeah.
Does this scheme require simulators that are not so costly to run? Because since the data set is generated by the simulators, I assume that they have to be like cheap to compute.
Yeah, it depends on like applications. So in some applications they are very costly. In some others, like you can have a actually tiny simulator. Then what is the complexity of the problem you are solving? But there is no actual requirement that the simulator should be small or large or something. I mean, it works in all simulators if you give it enough computational resources. That's basically the answer. Yeah.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, but this amortized inference part only makes sense for expensive simulations. For example, the reason we emphasize this so much and we had to do this so much was this simulator in this particle physics case was so expensive. We really need to like run it in a very efficient way at inference time. You cannot afford to run this millions of times. With this neural network proposals, you increase your sample efficiency. And it means in practice, you can do things much faster. Actually, this is what is explained here, and I forgot to mention. So when you do this neural network based one, you can do like embarrassing the parallel distributed inference, which means like you can run to the degree that you can afford. You can run many copies of the simulator with this trained network and like give the observed data, and the simulators run in a way that like reproduce your observed data. So we explained this actually a bit in a complicated way. Let me see if I can rewind the discussion a bit. It's a bit difficult, but basically, so at inference time, so you have your observed data, you have your trained network, you give the observed data to the trained network, and when you run the simulator is going to ask for some random numbers because it's what it does. Every time the simulator asks for a random number, you catch that and you don't give it the random number anymore, like the one it expects. You give it the random number that the neural network tells you. So the neural network has a history or like experience of seeing millions of these things during the training, and it knows if I suggest this type of random numbers, it's probably going to do the job of like producing this type of data. So the network learns that, and it basically guides the simulator to produce traces that end up simulating data that looks like your observed data. That's like the high level summary here. So your neural network controls and guides the simulator to produce data that looks like your observed data. So that's the overall explanation of the inference engine. In detail, there are a lot of different ways of achieving that, like an inference algorithm wise. So when you have this like traces at the end, conditioned on your observed data, you get a distribution over all these latent choices that are basically posterior distributions. So yeah, this is another way of showing that. So somebody in our team, like one of the particle physics people, he really likes this way of explaining things. It's like a puppet master. So you do this thing on the top is the machine learning or probabilistic programming system, and the thing in the bottom is the simulator. So it's like the machine learning system is controlling the simulator in a way that creates the observed data, like that creates data that looks like observed data. It's like a machine learning system has the full control, and the simulator is being controlled by this inference engine. So this slide is slightly unnecessary. So it's a lot of things. So this is basically showing you the projects that were implemented to make this type of thing possible. So this is interesting for probabilistic programming community. So the the system is called PyProb. This is the thing for connecting random number samplings in different languages, as I mentioned. So if you heard about this ONNX or ONNX, I don't know how to read it. So there is this like a framework for exchanging models between different deep learning frameworks. Like you can train something in PyTorch and load it in TensorFlow and this type of thing. So this PPX is an analog of that. It basically allows you to take any model, implement it in any of these languages, and control it to any probabilistic programming system, implement it in another language. It's like a exchange protocol for people who care about that. And yeah, so there are a lot of people here, and the idea is like all these things started because we were in a physics collaboration. I initiated that, and it ended up accumulating a lot of people. So we had a very long-running project where we were basically developing this probabilistic programming technique and doing physics applications and running code in very big machines and things like that. So, and the collaboration is called Atilim. It's like the word simulate backwards. So it's like a way of saying we take simulators and we invert them. It's basically something like that. And this is the field for person Fatma was talking about, this guy. Some of these people are very interesting. So this is like the head of the supercomputing group. Now he's at Microsoft, but he was like the Lawrence Berkeley Lab director. They provided compute capacity. These people are like physicists. This is a guy, he was involved in the discovery of the Higgs boson. And the rest, like some of them are physicists, like three people. You need three types of people. You need compute people who provide like support for compute and make the simulator run very fast. So because of that, you have Intel and the supercomputing. You need domain experts, like the physicists who have an understanding of machine learning so that you can communicate. And you need machine learning people. So this is how the interdisciplinary thing looks like. You need a lot of people to come and talk to each other. Yeah. So the part until now was like the general introduction. And this is about the particle physics case. And which actually reminds me that I spent a lot of slides without showing you any posterior distribution notation. I think it was for making things simpler. So what happens in practice is this, like maybe this is a repetition, but so this line here is a division between the simulated world and the real world. So the top part is the simulation, okay? So you have these simulators called Sherpa and Jian. These are C++ simulators, very big. And they implement the standard model of particle physics. There are these 16 elementary particles. They interact with each other. It's quantum mechanics, like super crazy, very big code base. Everything is in C++. And this thing implements a prior distribution. So this thing. So, and the notation usually is that, so X is your latents, all the latents in the system, and Y are the observables. And in this case, the observable is a three-dimensional thing, basically representing the output of a particle physics detector, like such as this one. And in the real world, like you have the Large Hadron Collider, the thing in the tunnel, like kilometers underground, and you have these giant detectors. And in practice, you run this machine, you get the observable, let's say some 3D data, and the task is to create this pipeline on the top, the simulation pipeline. Every time you run this, it generates like an imaginary collision event in the simulator and generates some synthetic data. And at inference time, somebody gives you like a real data from the real world, and you are supposed to take this, run your simulator many times. Imagine like you are running this millions of times and looking for simulated data cases that are similar to your observed data. It's basically like a trial and error type of thing. In practice, it's not like that, but it's very similar. So you run it many, many times, trying to create things that look like your observation. And the way to judge that is a likelihood distribution, this thing, this P of Y given X. So I should have maybe included these things here, but people sometimes get bored to see that. So the Bayesian inference formula, right? So you have three pieces. You have a prior, you have a posterior, and you have a likelihood. Actually, they are here. So this is your prior distribution, like your general description of what the latents can do in the system. The likelihood part is this, like you have a distribution of data given your latents, right? So these two things are enough to get a posterior given some observed data. So you evaluate the likelihood of the observed data under each simulation by this, and you can use this likelihood to basically construct some sample-based approximation of the posterior. Again, I didn't tell you exactly how it works under the hood, and it's actually a bit complicated. But this is what's happening. So in this work, we were looking at like basic problem, like basic from machine learning side, not so basic from the actually the opposite. Basic from the physics side, not so basic from the machine learning side. Like we wanted to start small, and this is called the tau lepton decay. It's a particle called the tau lepton, and it can decay in a lot of ways. So this is like an unstable thing. It just disappears. If for some reason this is created in the universe, it doesn't stay around so much. It decays into other products, and this is like a histogram of what types of things it can decay into. And there are 38 ways this thing can decay. Okay, and some of them are extremely unlikely. This is like a logarithmic scale, and the task is to simulate this, get some observed data, and try to infer what type of decay happened in the simulator. And we had this at the NERPS conference last year. So in practice, these simulator addresses that I talked to you about, they look like that. So I actually explained this a bit. And when we did this for this giant C++ simulator, we discovered around 25,000 addresses. So that's another important point, because in probabilistic modeling, people most of the time have fixed latent spaces. Like, for example, if you heard about probabilistic graphical models or some like historical ways of modeling things, you have like fixed latent spaces most of the time. It means the number of your latent variables stays the same. In this type of thing, like probabilistic programming, because you are using open-ended Turing complete languages like C++, it means every time you run your simulator, you can have a completely different number of random samples. Like there is nothing to prevent one simulation to sample millions of random variables, and maybe the next one is just going to sample 10 things. So every time you run it, the trace length, the execution trace changes. So this is actually very interesting and complicated from machine learning. So this is why we say this model has at least 25,000 addresses, latent variables. Theoretically, it has unlimited latent addresses, like it can go to infinity. And the more you run it, the more you discover latent addresses. So it's like a completely open-ended inference problem. And this number is actually really big. And this is the reason you need amortized inference and all that extra stuff. So to my knowledge, this is like one of the biggest Bayesian inference things in like a Turing complete system. Yeah, so these are some extra details about showing you how these things are in practice. Again, like we discovered in this very big C++ simulator, some 450 ways of ordering the random number samples. So if these these things are so long and ugly looking, nobody can remember that. We give them short names like A1, A2, like address 1, address 6, whatever. So when you have these like unique labels, you can also show the ordering of these random number calls. So most of the cases have like this ordering. They have the same ordering, but the sampled values will be different for each sample. Like most of them are continuous distributions. This is what we call a trace type. So this unique ordering of addresses with different sampled values, we call it a trace type. And we identified for this lepton decay problem, there are around like 450 trace types. And again, this is also unlimited theoretically. And yeah, so these are some results. So in practice, what happens is you get some, like first we do with MCMC sampling. That is very inefficient and it takes a long time. And it's very, difficult actually. It takes so much time and so much effort. So, but you do that once for establishing the correct answer, because otherwise there is no way of proving you got the correct posterior. If you do MCMC, there are things called MCMC diagnostics, like a Gaussian-Rubin convergence or autocorrelation, whatever, like the log probability trace plots and things. Basically, there are some techniques that you can look at and say, okay, I run this enough, this is the correct answer. So we do that first to establish this is the correct answer in the distribution space. And we show, for example, histograms for the posterior distribution of some of the latents, like that matter for the problem, like the energy of the particle, the type of decay. This thing is a categorical of 38 things. It's very difficult to read, I know, but like so you can see that this is the decay channel. So we do that, and it takes around like 115 hours to get this type of thing. Then we do the amortized inference one, and like that's embarrassing, meaning like you don't have to. It's not sequential. MCMC is sequential. In the amortized inference case, we can get the same result in 30 minutes. Like this is a huge factor of improvement. And actually, it's also unbounded. Like the more compute capacity you have, the less this number can be. You can really parallelize that with the neural network instances and get it run really fast. So this matters because if in practice this type of systems will be deployed in an experiment like CERN, they need these things to run really, really fast. Okay, and this is why they are not doing any Bayesian inference in practice currently. Yeah, so this is basically how we established it in the paper. So you are showing two inference engines. The RMH one is the MCMC, the Monte Carlo one, that is costly, and IC is the one supported by the neural network. And you show they line up with some like degree of tolerance, that they give the same answer, and that shows you that you actually get the correct answer for the distributions. So yeah, there are some other extra things that come from this type of approach. It's mostly about interpretability. So in this talk, I didn't cover that, but you could also try to do the same thing with the deep generative model. So you can train again, let's say you can get a lot of this 3D data from the detector I'm talking about. Train again, or a variational autoencoder, or some of the deep learning based things. And like also try to like, I don't know, infer or like get the distribution over like predictions, like predictions over the latents that you care about. You can set up such a deep learning system. It might work to some degree, but in this setting, like, and in this simulation-based stuff, you really care about the interpretability aspect, because you have a very detailed latent space modeled by your simulator. And because of this like probabilistic programming approach, every time you get this type of distribution, you get a full, complete explanation of actually what's happening to produce that type of data. So that's like a very important part. And so you can make this type of plots. Like this is not so interpretable, but it's a kind of interesting angle. This was actually an accident. So these things work by like, okay, let me start here. So when we show this plot, if you can see, like we show some of the latents that are interesting to look at. Okay, so this latent histograms here. But in practice, so I mentioned, if you remember, I mentioned there are thousands of latents in the simulator. Actually, in practice, any distribution results you get are always over the whole latent space of the simulator. That is always like thousands of things. So this is how one of them can look like it does look like. And this is very interesting because people didn't have this thing before. So there are techniques we are trying to develop that allow you to interpret what's actually going on in the simulator. So one thing is to like make the histograms for all these like thousands of latents. That is a bit crazy. The other thing is to like make some address graphs that I'm going to show a bit better in the coming slides. At the end of the day, yeah, I don't know how much detail I should go into, but like, so this simulate these things have, how can I say that? So there is, okay, maybe we shouldn't go there, but there is something called rejection sampling. in many simulators, there are for loops, like, or while loops or something. There are some loops happening in the program that have a terminating condition, and until that termination happens, it keeps sampling stuff. So all these nodes you see in this thing, in this crazy plot, is like they are not random number samples, and they keep sampling, and it goes all the way, like this is a zoomed in part of the center. It is basically a loop in the program space, and the loop in this plot here, like it's just a nice coincidence that they are both loops. It loops by sampling a lot of things, like a lot of times, until something is satisfied, and you terminate the loop and keep running the other one. So you can have other loops, and you basically the majority of the program sampling happens here in this representation. And all these things going outwards, like these four big things and small things, they are sampling loops, basically. They are for loops that create these random number samples. It's very difficult to interpret when you look at it this way, but we will have a better version of it in the coming slide. Yeah, and before that, we had I mean, this is kind of a joke. We have a running joke with our particle physics collaborators, because the first time I showed this type of plot in a conference, somebody took a photo and made fun of me in Twitter. Like they say, like it's like the biggest number of plots in histograms in a given slide in history or something. It was like a strange joke. Then we started doing that, and like in the next presentation, the Lucas, like one of the people at CERN, when he was giving another talk, like he was showing the previous joke and like putting more plots, and like I don't know how to explain. This is like a silly joke that is running. I think we should stop doing this at some point. But like here you see Lucas showing this. Inside that I am here, somebody on Twitter said something. Inside that there's another one. It's like an Inception type of thing. It's going on forever, and it's basically our miserable way of having fun with thousands of plots. So okay, so this is the last part. So this is about interpretability. So when you look at this type of thing, it's crazy, but you can interpret there are some sampling loops are happening, okay? But it's difficult to understand what's going on here and what is your explanation of the data. So there are better ways. This is one of them. So there are ways of collapsing these graphs into like easier to understand versions of themselves by reducing these repetitions into one node. For example, if an address is constantly sampled, like in a sequence, you don't have to show all of them in these crazy loops. You can just show them as a single node. When you do that, things look a bit simpler. And for example, if you take the 10 most frequent trace types in a simulator, you end up with this type of thing. So all the so there's a start node here. So that's the beginning of the simulator, and then end node. This is the end. And I'm not going to details for the colors, but the blue things are data, like for which we have likelihood distributions, and you can imagine all the other things are latent distributions. And there are some cycles here. For example, every time you run the simulator, always you end up in this random number sample, then this one, this one, this one. You can see up to here, they are always following each other in all the sequence, like it never changes. So it means if you look at the simulator code, you will see this is the first random sample, this is the second one, this is the third one, or whatever. And there is no other way, like these are really happening in sequence. So it means the value sampled here didn't affect the control flow. You went to the next one, next one, next one. But when you come here, there are two things that can happen. So you can either go to this one, and you can repeat this sample. So it shows that as a result of the random sample here, there is an if condition or something, some control flow structure in the code that can do different choices. Okay, so this type of like cycles and arrows going backward is a way of showing the control flow in the model. And these things are interpretable because if you remember this like labels I tried to explain before, so all these things are connected to the code base. So you can look at this, you can see, oh, this is the label. This means I'm generating a hadron, and it's a uniform prior distribution. Or this one is, for example, if you look at the end of it, you can see it's a categorical distribution over 38 things. And it is actually, if you remember the 38 types of decay that can happen. So when you look at these things, you can interpret that. You can say these are the samples for the particles, some properties. Here is the place where I make the decision of which decay event this is going to be, and things like that. So you can keep interpreting these things. And some of the examples are here. So this thing colorimeter is the detector, basically, the particle physics detector. This is the rejection sampling I talked about, decay channel and things like that. And interesting thing is, so this is the picture when you get, when you construct these things from like 10 most frequent trace types. You can look at it in more detail. If you take 25 most frequent trace types, it's still the same simulator, and you start seeing less frequent things happening, and it completes your picture. So it's like you increase the resolution of your description of the simulator to show you less and less frequent things, and it completes the picture. Basically, the more you run the simulator and collect this data, the traces, and make this plot, you basically discover the internal probabilistic model structure of a given simulator. So this is a very interesting new tool we developed. And if you keep doing that, so you keep discovering more and more things. And for a given data, like you can always have this interpretation. You can say, okay, for this data, I can see that this part of the model is used. This is what happens, and this is this type of event. Like, so this is something in addition to the posterior distribution histograms. This is some interpretability under the model. So I imagine you are maybe more familiar with this, like deep generative models. People talk about, for example, disentangled representations, right? They are trying to learn some latent structure from data. Oops, sorry. I hope that wasn't too bad. I dropped my microphone. So they learn some latent representation, which is interpretable, disentangled or something. So in this type of setting, the things are disentangled from the beginning, like because they are defined completely as like in a latent structure, and this thing allows you to discover that latent structure basically. Okay, so this is the last part actually. So these things are a bit difficult, like it's very difficult to cover in one talk. So we are running, I mean, a lot of things. So this is a summary. Maybe one of the interesting things is this surrogates. So we talked about the inference part where you are trying to invert a simulator. You can also do things in the prediction direction, in the forward direction. You can learn a surrogate model for a complicated simulator to basically, you can use deep learning to approximate the forward simulator. And it is not going to be exact, but it's going to be very fast. So this is a very interesting thing people are working on. And these rejection sampling loops are basically terrible. We are trying to find ways of better ways of handling them. And like in general, there's a lot of work happening currently about applying all these techniques to different simulators in different fields. And so some of the things I'm doing right now is, so there is this one about composite material simulation. So they have a simulation about how these wings are constructed. There's like a Turing process. It's about materials engineering. We had some papers with some people, I think Fatma knows, for example, that's like Bradley and Christian. These guys, like they had epidemiology simulators. There is a malaria simulator. Actually, during the pandemic, we had the Imperial College simulator. That was like the reason or all the world shut down. So they have a C simulator. We work with that a bit to see what it's doing. And I'm also working with the Space Agency, European Space Agency, about modeling satellite collisions or spacecraft collisions. So you have a model that models orbital characteristics. It's a very well understood problem. It's Newtonian physics. And you are trying to predict if things are going to collide to each other. And it's an interesting problem. That's basically, so we have this workshop that I mentioned. If any of you are attending the NERVS conference online this year, like I think it's in some days or I don't know, 3 weeks, I don't remember. So please check the workshop. The workshop is completely about using machine learning for physical problems like this. So that's all. I hope I'm on time.
Dinesh, thank you so much. This was
All right.
cool, like as close as machine learning gets to rocket science, I would say.
Okay, thank you.
Let's take some questions from the audience. Are there any questions for Güneş? I mean, there were some questions during the talk, but
Yeah.
Can I ask one question? So
Yeah.
I'm curious how what we choose as the inputs to this model we are creating, because we are having this stacked traces and the random variables, but are we just including the random values, or are we including some structure of how these values are generated as inputs as well?
I see. So yeah, there is a structure definitely. So I think I failed to show that. I mean, like in another talk, I had a better. But basically, it's a very big code base. Like somebody sit down and wrote a very big C++ program. Let's say the structure is the program itself. So the program tells you. So for example, you start the program. It runs a lot of deterministic things. We don't see them because they are deterministic. We don't care about that. So all these nodes are random samples. So between these things, there can be a lot of things happening, and all these things have a structure. So actually, the structure you are talking about is the structure that is shown in this graph. So you can see what depends on what. For example, you can see this is the order. This is probably like at this node, because there are different behaviors observed. It means there is some like conditional execution here. After this sample, there is an if statement somewhere, and you can go and actually find that where it is. That makes a choice. You sample a random number. You see that there is a lots of like conditional dependencies like that in the code base. So does this answer, like, so you are not learning the model, you are actually working with a model that is already written, and the written model itself has all the structure, like the structure is there in the beginning. Does that make sense?
It makes sense to me, but
Yeah.
I still don't understand it fully, I think, because
Okay.
if I understand it right, this is representation, this graph we are seeing is something that we generate from like the observations of running the simulation a lot of times,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
I'm curious about the first RNN picture you were showing us, this recurrent neural network that was taking all the variables. And while training that thing, do we have this graph in hand, and is this graph affecting how we train that RNN in any way?
No, so this graph is about the simulator, and the RNN, actually, yeah, I see the confusion. The RNN is something separate from this. Like RNN is something that takes like let's say this is the observed data, this last blue thing. You give the blue thing to the RNN, and RNN can give you values for random number samples in this graph, but it is not the graph, like it's not connected with the graph. Maybe it was a bit confusing. One thing I remembered is I can show you a little demo. I don't know how much time people have here. I don't want to take your time, but I can show you like a 2-minute demo of how this thing works like that. Maybe it can help with stuff. Should I do that?
go ahead, please.
Okay, let's try to find that. Where is that? Yeah.
My students from Comp 100 are also arriving for our office hour, but I think this is cool for them. It's
Okay,
not.
so I promise it's not going to take more than 2 minutes. Okay.
Please go ahead. I think it's interesting for everyone.
Okay, so I'm going to show you how this thing works in practice. Okay, so I guess maybe this one. So this is actually like a little demo, like example. And in practice, so okay, I'm going to put this one here, and let's see if this thing works. Do you see this, like balls are jumping around?
Yeah.
Okay, so for example, this is a probabilistic program in Python in the system. And actually it's a physics problem, but the physics is very simple. Like, so you have this problem, like there's a Python game engine, it's called Pygame or PyMonk or whatever. So balls are coming from this like top left. They fall, they jump, and the goal is to maybe have some balls in this bucket here, okay? And the way in practice what you do is like, so this is the simulator part. We don't need to care about that. So this is the probabilistic model I keep talking about in the work. So you can see that, so this is the forward model. So, and the structure we are talking about is this structure here. In this toy problem, I have a prior distribution over ball radius. There is like a normal distribution here. You can see that ball radius is a normal distribution. Mean is 12 and standard deviation is 6, right? Then you sample a random number, and you get that as your ball radius. You have elasticity, you have a prior distribution, this is normal. You have a uniform distribution for the number of bumpers. So you can see I can have any number of these bumpers between 2 and 35. And there is a for loop, this is a structure. Then I sample where to put these bumpers. If you follow the code, I'm going a bit fast, but basically you create the, you sample something about the ball characteristics. You sample how many of these bumpers you want. Then you have a for loop, you place these things in XY coordinates and you run your simulator. And in the end, you count the number of balls in the bucket, and that's your observable data. So the simulation is like every time you run it, some sort of stuff happens. And the observable data is the number of balls in the bucket at the end of simulator. Okay, so I started going very fast. I don't know why I'm a bit panicking. So for example, so I'm going to show you a couple of different runs to show you like what is the variety of things that can happen here. And so when you run prior distribution, so for example, I'm running the simulator 500 times. It's going to finish in like 20 seconds. So there's like a counter here. So I'm running this 500 times now. And for each of these 500 times, I have an execution trace. And they record all these choices here, like the prior choices about these things, this one, and all of that. And as you can see, actually, the number of latents is going to be different in each simulator because the number of X and Y coordinates depend on the number sampled for the number of bumpers. And for example, you can plot these things. So I make this type of plot and some histograms like I chose. For example, this is the distribution of the bumpers coordinates because I put a normal distribution. They are mostly distributed somewhere in the middle of this thing. Number of bumpers is between 2 and 35 that I showed you. This is a uniform distribution. Ball radius and elasticity are normal, as you can see. And this is the number of balls in the box in the prior case. So you can see even if it's very unlikely, there are some configurations where you actually have balls in the bucket, like just by randomly. So then we come to the posterior part. And so the posterior is the same thing. Like you run the simulator many times, but you have this conditioning thing where you will evaluate the likelihood and you get the posterior distribution. So let's run that one. So I'm going to run this 1,000 times. I record 1,000 execution traces. And the condition or the observed data is I observe the balls in the box variable to be 10, okay? So this observation basically relates to this line here, this observe statement in probabilistic programming. It means I have a variable called balls in the box. And this is the likelihood distribution. And the likelihood is parameterized by the actual simulated value in each case. And the likelihood is evaluated, and this allows you to construct the posterior. I realize I'm going too fast, but I'm also willing to share this thing so you can play with it after the talk. You can have a look, or like you can go to maybe some tutorials and things. I can share some material for people interested. So yeah, so when this finishes, I think we will be also finished. Okay. Yeah, so I run it 1,000 times, this time with this condition of like having balls in the bucket. Okay, so then if I do like a posterior plot, this is how it looks like. So I ended up with balls in bucket. And you can see this is different from the prior because to achieve some like outcome, like the balls in the bucket, apparently you need to put your bumper somewhere in this area because it makes sense. But there are also some like different ways of achieving the same thing. Like you can have multimodal cases. So for example, let's sample something from the posterior and see what happens. So that type of stuff happened. Or like there are different ways. So for example, in the previous example, the balls were very big. And maybe for that, you need a different configuration of stuff. Here it's small and you need a different configuration. So there are multiple ways of achieving something. And this gives you a distribution over all the varieties. So it gives you some uncertainty and like some like probabilistic distribution over explaining something or achieving something. And like, yeah, so I should finish here, but the structure we are talking about is this structure. The structure is determined by the person who actually writes the code of the probabilistic program. Okay.
Güneş, this is super cool.
Yeah.
This is your, I guess, toy setup to test things, right?
Yeah, the toy setup to like show to people. Yeah, not
That's
the
It
yeah
would
the
be great
test.
if you can share this and students can play with it if they want. I mean,
Yeah.
it's like a few lines of code and you can achieve these things. It's great.
All right. Yeah. I can send this.
That's perfect. Any
All
other
right.
questions? Last question, maybe? For Güneş? Okay.
No, I hope people are not sleeping or something.
I loved it. I don't know.
Okay.
Give some
It was
reaction
great.
for Güneş.
Thank you.
All right. Okay.
Can I ask a last question, maybe?
Yeah.
So is it nonsense to use this insights to give feedbacks for simulation so that you are observing some non-frequently used distribution nodes in the simulation that maybe can you give some feedbacks to simulation people?
Yes, absolutely. Actually, that's a very good question. I'm very impressed. This thing happened. So, for example, I was doing this Sherpa simulation. I was in a physics conference. The people who were developing that simulation, they came to me and they said, we are going to use this for debugging our simulator because it's a very big simulator. They want to identify the conditions under which like some specific part of the simulator gets executed, like in practice. So this is exactly the type of thing, if I understand you correctly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Batuhan is a physicist, by the way.
Oh, okay, that makes sense.
He's doing a master in computer science, but his
I
background is in physics.
I see. Nice.
Great, great. I'm